in person. I very much hoped to be part of this conference on climate and apocalypse, to share conversations with all of you. This is a theme very close to my research, but I do hope that we get to have some exchange after this, and I would welcome any feedback on what I have to say. So the title of this talk is What is Bad About Doomsday? And it is really trying to bring together a couple of threads of some recent thinking about philosophical and theological understandings of extinction. And in particular, I'm interested in how apocalyptic thought either influences or challenges the way that our notions of time and extinction work, so our temporal frameworks for thinking about the possibility of future extinction. So the term mass extinction has become a watchword of climate change prediction, with greater success, I suggest, than the word Anthropocene, even though the former is often discussed in the context of the latter. And considering its rhetorical potential, this is unsurprising. Earlier this year, for example, the Daily Mail ran a story with the following headline: "Will global warming lead to the apocalypse? Earth's worst mass extinction was caused by runaway climate change, and experts warn it could happen again." So this refers to a proposed comparison between current rates of species loss and the previous mass extinctions, including the Great Permian mass extinction 250 million years ago, in which 90% of all life was wiped from the surface of the Earth. And paleobiologists think that the causes of this mass eradication of life may include climate change. But what is noticeable about the way that the report runs is it's able to bring a world separated from us by unfathomably large geological timescales to bear upon our present life and fears. So it's a world involving the great dying of most species, but also lethal acid rain, volcanic eruptions, widespread forest fires. A world we can very much imagine as our own. And in similar vein, witness recent claims that an end to Homo sapiens could, as a knock-on effect of mass extinction, be witnessed within 100 years, a claim made first by the microbiologist Frank Fenner in 2010, and then 5 years later by the science writer David Auerbach. And these were and are highly speculative and attention-grabbing claims, also made arguably on behalf of an urgent moral cause, but I wonder whether what they would command half as much attention if the future scenarios they depict had been temporally more distant or more ambiguous. And if they couldn't, I'm interested in what this tells us about the uses and usefulness of linking apocalyptic and millennial belief to the moral crisis of climate change. And I want to address that concern by bringing together two types of inquiry that I think are normally kept far apart. The first is philosophical, and it asks broadly what type of responses the possibility of human extinction generates or ought to generate, and then what do those responses tell us about ourselves and what we care about. The second inquiry is more theological and asks whether there is anything specific to Jewish and early Christian literature labelled apocalyptic that might illuminate, problematize, or otherwise contribute to that philosophical question. So let me turn first to the philosophical mode of inquiry. What sort of wrong or harm does extinction represent? And there are fewer philosophical studies responding to this question than you might expect. But one of the most intriguing recent attempts comes from the philosopher Sam Scheffler. In his 2013 Tanner Lectures, Death and the Afterlife, Scheffler considers what it is that makes the prospect of the end of the world so disturbing to humans. In essence, his argument comes down to this. First, it is reasonable to suppose that the anticipation of an imminent end to all human existence would render much of what we do in the present meaningless, or at least greatly diminished in value. And second, if we accept this claim, this reveals important things about human value. More specifically, it reveals an implied connection between ethics and temporality, because it means that the value that we ascribe to projects in our lives is dependent upon some notion of their continuation, their afterlife. By afterlife, Scheffler means the continuation of human lives in the plural after we are dead. He is not referring to the religious belief in personal immortality. Let's look at how he arrives at this conclusion. He asks us to imagine a scenario in which we knew that 30 days after our own natural death, the Earth would be utterly destroyed. With this knowledge, he asks, would we seriously find value in the pursuits we currently undertake? His scenario assumes unequivocal epistemic certainty. There is no doubt that there will be no world 30 years after our personal life ends. And the point of the scenario is that it forces us to consider whether our present projects, values and commitments are dependent upon at least some minimal guarantee of temporal continuity. And Scheffler concludes that for a significant amount of them, this is absolutely right. Either we would find less value in, or perhaps give up entirely, such activities as researching a cure for cancer, having children, or campaigning for the radical reduction of global carbon emissions. Now, clearly he can't base this upon any factual evidence, but he can appeal to the reasonableness of assuming that people like us would respond in such a way. And he appeals to a scenario sketched in P.D. James's novel Children of Men. That story presents a different scenario to the sudden cataclysmic perspective of a nuclear attack or asteroid strike, by focusing more on the status and quality of being the last humans. In James's novel, the world's human population becomes suddenly infertile, and societies must adjust to being the last generation. The characters in that story become apathetic and despairing, struggling to know what is worth fighting for, what projects are worth continuing, what grounds there are even for pleasure for leading hedonistic lives. And if we find such a reaction plausible, goes the argument, we would reasonably conclude that the worth of most human projects is only coherent alongside the belief in the continuation of the species. And therefore, we ought to care for the continuation of the human species above all things. Now, there have been numerous objections to Scheffler's argument, some of them quite convincing in my view, and many that appear in the same volume that published his thesis. And I don't want to rehearse those objections here in detail. And in fact, I want to delimit my criticism to those aspects of it which I believe are representative of a quite widespread assumption about the potential and the function of doomsday scenarios to motivate moral behavior. That assumption is summed up in one of his sub-conclusions, in essence. The afterlife thesis, he believes, is good news for those who are concerned about moral motivation to combat such species-threatening phenomena as climate change, or presumably nuclear war. It is good news because it means that humans are probably a lot less selfish, individualistic, and short-sighted than many of us assumed them to be. And following this, it is reasonable to expect them to do everything in their power to prevent an event that would precipitate their untimely extinction. But for me, what is problematic about this claim is that it requires a minimally clear sense of what would count as a future that is indefinitely long enough, in Scheffler's words, to valorize the commitments of the present. How does one define a healthy and indefinitely long future? The characters in the Children of Men scenario do have a future. They have the rest of their lives. But if we decide that this is too short to motivate meaningful projects of the kind that Scheffler cites, the ones that require some guarantee that the human project itself is continued, we might want to specify where and how that line could be drawn. Would extinction in 2 generations' time provoke the same loss of meaning? How about 3 generations? And the point is true of a concern with the opposite end of the temporal spectrum. Scheffler is also interested in why it is that people tend not to suffer existential crises from the knowledge of our certain extinction in universal heat death in around 6 billion years' time. And this is also a focus of a particular critique by the philosopher Susan Wolfe. Scheffler's reply is that the spatio-temporal scale involved in such reflection is simply too big to get our heads around. This seems like common sense. It comes as no surprise that most people do not have such anxieties as the famous scene in Woody Allen's Annie Hall, which Scheffler cites, in which a young Alvey singer is refusing to do his homework because he's just found out that the universe is expanding and will one day break apart. "What has the universe got to do with it?" replies his mother. "You're here in Brooklyn. Brooklyn is not expanding." The comic effect derives from the juxtaposition of mundane cares of the present with what would otherwise be known as cosmic pessimism. But the comedy works because the flip side is also at least plausible. Alvey might have a point. The mundane cares of his mother and teacher are juxtaposed against his justified existential angst that has been suddenly awakened to the ultimate finitude of all things, its common destiny in oblivion. Against this realization, doing your homework suddenly seems pointless. I'd suggest that most of us have had at least occasionally an Alvey Singer moment. But more broadly, this point becomes interesting and problematic element of doomsday rhetoric from the point of view of a phenomenon like climate change. For if the notion of being the last generation is morally and existentially disastrous, it seems to demand that we do clarify more precisely in what sense a long future or a short future consists and can be the basis for our moral deliberation. And it brings us back to the scenario in which a predicted end of the human species within 100 years is presented. What does that tell us about our ability and the grounds for valuing current human projects? Because a scenario closer to home is one in which I know that human extinction will occur at some point in the future, and perhaps closer than had previously been predicted, but I am not certain whether it will be in hundreds, thousands, or hundreds of thousands of years' time. We can extend this ambiguity further by imagining a doomsday scenario in which perhaps not all, but most of humanity is wiped out. Or one in which the quality of life of the remnant of the population is vastly diminished or rendered in the eyes of some inhuman. This is arguably the scenario closer to the rhetoric of extinction from climate change scenarios. What if the future of humanity is being certainly curtailed, but within a time frame that is uncertain, and in which our present actions do have a hand? How would we manage the translation of that form of catastrophic imagination into ethical commitment? And it's at this point that I want to turn to the possible theological resourcing of this debate, or at least to turn to how theology might introduce more complexity, more nuance into our understanding of time in this context. When it comes to religious apocalypticism, a common assumption is that this same logic of shortening or quickening, bringing to bear into present lives the prophecy of an incoming future is adopted for a rhetorical purpose. So as Stephen O'Leary writes, one rarely hears, for example, of an apocalyptic movement that predicts global catastrophe and divine judgment to occur hundreds of thousands of years in the future. Such movements only become controversial when their predictions are relevant to the concerns of the present. And this would largely explain the attraction to dispensational millennialists, such as we see in the Rapture Ready website, to the practice of decoding contemporary ecological catastrophes, which recently have begun to include recording species extinctions and an anticipation of a mass extinction event. Christian apocalypse, of course, can resource this imagination very well. In the book of Revelation, the fate of non-human creatures features prominently in the eschatological narrative. For example, in chapter 8, when the sounding of the first trumpet brings death for a third of all living things in the sea. Nevertheless, I want to mention a couple of ways that apocalyptic literature might at least present us with a more complex model of time and the future. And the first thing I would note is that in several cases, apocalyptic literature does not simply provide one authoritative historical narrative. It typically juxtaposes and puts into dualistic tension two forms of time, that of human and creaturely time and that of God's time, the unfolding of prophecy according to God's eternal kingdom. In apocalyptic texts, and for example in the book of Daniel, this takes on the form of depicting the tension between imperial time and the time of the end. So a succession of imperial regimes are prophesied to have their allotted time in which they will rise up against Jerusalem before the end of time, when all human dominion will cease. And as the theologian Lieven Berver has put it in the Christian context, apocalyptic does not merely portray God entering into and directing historical events as chronology. It represents the incursion of God into history as the boundary of time itself, making humans constantly aware of this contrast. Now, on the one hand, this model of time appears overwhelmingly to lend itself to a deterministic perspective of history. Unlike some uses of prophetic literature that might seek to swerve the course of history by warning of cataclysmic consequences of present actions, apocalypses seem like a done deal. One cannot change the events that are revealed because they are unalterable. They are sealed. How then could apocalyptic literature inform ethical thinking about the future? A common assumption is that audiences of more widely eschatological literature, including the letters of St. Paul and parts of the Synoptic Gospels, feared the end of the world in their lifetime and thus abandoned normal ethical social commitments in favour of extreme asceticism, piety or righteous anger, qualities embodied in figures such as John the Baptist or embodied in the ascetic demands of the Essene community at Qumran, for example. But the theologian Dale C. Allison also argues that human behaviour in the face of impending doom probably reflected values and beliefs already held rather than introduced new ones. Apocalyptic literature, whilst intensely ethical, as Allison put it, does not create a moral tradition so much as intensify the imperatives of a tradition already held. Thus, on the one hand, for some apocalyptic audiences, nothing at all changes. The imperative is to continue holding on to one's observance of religious law and custom in the face of catastrophe. Such a notion also appeals to the common wisdom and is reflected in some cultural portrayals of Doomsday. So, for example, in the 1998 film Last Night, citizens of Toronto spend their last night on Earth according to a spectrum of impulses and behaviours with which they began, from the hedonistic to the pious to the apathetic. But clearly one of the argued functions of apocalyptic literature is that by bringing the end into proximity with present life, responsibility to one's ethical and religious code is heightened. In a sort of reversal of the afterlife thesis, Allison notes that pious apocalypse audiences would have interpreted them as exhortations to ready themselves by increasing vigilance. The imminence of end times is a safeguard against complacency and procrastination. This is the eschatological sense, for example, of Jesus' parable of the wise and foolish virgins, which divides those who are ready and prepared for the wedding from those who are unprepared, Watch therefore, for you do not know the hour of his coming. So the ethics of living in apocalyptic time would at least seem to require something of a revelation of a common mortality, including not only my personal extinction, but collective human extinction. A reminder of the death of the world as we know it. But the fact that it does so within frequently coded temporality seems important. In several eschatological texts, there is either an explicit prohibition against predicting the date and time of the eschaton, as with Paul's letter to the Thessalonians, in which he admonishes believers not to consider dates or times, but to be aware only that the day of the Lord will come at a time not of their choosing, like a thief in the night. Or there is a reminder that what is revealed is beyond our comprehension. In Daniel's final vision concerning the resurrection of the dead at the end of time, he sees a man ask the one clothed in linen, "How long shall it be before the end of these wonders?" Daniel cannot understand the answer that he is given and is told, "Go your way, Daniel, for the words are to remain secret and sealed until the end of the time of the end. Many shall be purified, cleansed, and refined, but the wicked shall continue to act wickedly. None of the wicked shall understand, but those who are wise shall understand." So time and again in apocalyptic literature, we find this attempt to combine a sense of living in the end times, calling listeners to radically question social and ethical priorities given the proximity of the end, with an awareness that humans are not in control of that timing, and importantly, human folly prevents us from decoding its meaning, from mixing the meanings of near and far. Ethics, the practice of living well, living justly, must operate within this state of uncertainty with regard to the time that remains. So perhaps this is one way that the peculiar genre of apocalyptic literature might contribute to our broader understanding of the complexities about how doomsday arguments work or might work, and how this might inform philosophical and ethical understandings of extinction, particularly the time of extinction. There seems to be a basic weakness in the assumption that many of our ethical commitments only make sense when viewed through, in Sam Scheffler's words, a proprietary attitude to valuing. That is, where the idea of some indefinite control of the future, of owning the future, guarantees meaning to one's present actions. Whereas apocalyptic discourse is at least more complex. It is about the juxtaposition of the near and the far, the intensely present and the cosmically distant, the very boundary of time brought in our midst. And Allison's point about apocalyptic ethics rings true for doomsday arguments as well. Introducing a time limit to human existence will not introduce a new moral tradition. It may heighten the ones that we already have, but equally it may deaden them. What needs reinventing are the traditions themselves. Thank you very much.
So we're just going to Skype. Hi, Stefan.
Hi.
Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, great.
Brilliant, okay.
Hi, everybody.
So I'm going to ask, is there a question? It's not quite happened yet, I don't think, but it's imminent, I believe. I explained to everyone why you couldn't be here today.
Right. You've got me reaching for my phone.
I'm going to start with Chris.
It's not happened yet.
Start with Chris and I'll come to you, Rupert, okay?
Thanks, Stefan. I enjoyed that. I agree with the basic thesis, but I want to just say two things. First of all, I think I want to put in a plea for the prophetic discourse in the Hebrew Bible, that I think that the doomsday scenario, which one finds in a lot of the prophetic oracles, I think is really important in our present situation, and I think needs rescuing from those texts which actually kind of make it that it's going to work out okay in the end. And that's just kind of one thing just to say about the importance of that. With regard to the what you call Christian apocalyptic theology, I think what we also need to rescue is the fact that if the New Testament means anything to me at all, it's about communities trying to work out how it is they are living in a situation in which they are believing that the end of this age is coming and a new age is coming, and yet at the same time are wanting to bring about a degree of transformation. If I could link it with something that we heard this morning about the relationship between transition and transformation, I think if the New Testament isn't about that, I'll eat my hat.
Great. Yeah, I mean, I think I agree with all of those comments, and I'm certainly not arguing for one. I'm not presenting religious sources, New Testament sources, as providing one kind of answer. My own example, the texts that I've been looking at, I'm mostly interested in the way that they deal with this complex notion of time and an incoming future and crisis. But you're absolutely right that that is not the whole picture, and I think one of the fruits of much broader studies of apocalyptic literature is that you can talk about political liberation, you can talk about the understanding it as a story of from the viewpoint of the oppressed. All of those things can be read in different ways. I think what they certainly show is that there are, human history has a very rich traditions of understanding and responding to global crises. So I guess it's a reminder for us that our situation isn't unique in certain respects. In some respects it is, but certainly in terms of responses to crises, I don't think it is.
Thanks, Stefan. So I want to start off with what I think is a great work in recent years that I think makes the point that you were trying to make. So I'm thinking of Lars von Trier's masterwork, Melancholia, which is about how we should comport ourselves in the final days, hours, minutes, and seconds of our common existence. But it seems to me that while it's an absolutely crucial point, and it makes very clearly the point that many very important human activities do not require a long future in which to unfold. It seems to me that Scheffler's point that many important human activities do require a long future in which to unfold is also equally true. So I was unclear. It seemed to me that you were trying to make some kind of criticism of the children of men in relation to this, but it's unclear to me that works, or why it need contradict the kind of point we get from Melancholia. So in Children of Men, it seems to me what we get, and I think, by the way, we get it much better in the film than in the book.
Yeah, I agree.
We get a picture of an alarmingly plausible descent into selfishness and nihilism if we seem to be deprived of a long future. And one lesson we could learn from that is the desirability, not the necessity, but the desirability for meaning in our lives, of life going on, and ourselves not being extinguished, and being able to produce future generations and so on. And it seems to me that that point is obviously given additional force when it's considered in relation to our actual relation to a situation like the climate crisis, i.e. that we are actually culpable. The crisis actually is avoidable or in principle soluble, and that makes the whole thing a lot worse. So the lesson I took from Children of Men is that it actually is quite a powerful way of making a point about how crucial it is for many of the things that we do, not by any means for all, that we have a long future ahead of us as a species, that point is brought into stronger relief when, in the scenario we actually have, unlike in either of those two films, the extinguishing event is avoidable.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thanks for that. So one of my criticism of Scheffler is why he is that by picking the scenario presented by Children of Men, he is simplifying his the premise for his argument by saying, well, what would happen if we knew with certainty, with near certainty, that humans would cease to exist after a certain time. And I think what that doesn't show is the challenge of making ethical sense of an ambiguous stretch of time before us. And one of the things I didn't I sort of cut out of my talk was to mention a contrast with something that you mentioned in your talk this morning, McCarthy's The Road. And one of the more profound aspects of the Road's narrative is that it does exactly present a scenario. The relationship between the father and the son is one in which the thought experiment unfolding through their narrative is this radical uncertainty about whether they're the last human. So before they meet other humans, the father asks the son, or the son asks the father, what if we're the last ones on the earth? And I think the father says, how would we know, and why would that matter? And it becomes a theological discussion, because the son says, well, God would know, surely. And what I think McCarthy is doing that a scenario like the Children of Men cannot do is explore precisely ethics in epistemic uncertainty. So what does one do with the rest of one's existence, not knowing the road before you, or even the extent of the damage to which one lives in? So it's not so much a criticism of the Children of Men as why one would use that as an exploration for morality surrounding climate change. And I just think that narratives that explore that ambiguous space are much more useful for us, because they're close to the situation that we are in. We are not facing a certain asteroid strike. We're not facing a virus that's going to kill off the human population. We are in a situation in which the future is very ambiguous. And if we leave it to the sort of media portrayal of, right, some scientists said we've got 100 years, so I'll take that for granted. That's fairly useless in terms of helping humans to face ambiguous futures. But I absolutely agree with you that the Children of Men scenario does have something interesting to say, but for me it doesn't really get at the complexity at all.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, just a quick comeback. I think I understand that point better now. But it does seem to me that I still think we can have a kind of both-and situation here. I think your point is right, but it seems to me clear that we can learn stuff from both Children of Men and from Melancholia about the actual situation that we are in, partly by contrast. We might think of these situations as what Wittgenstein calls objects of comparison. So we learn from the similarities and from the differences. We don't think of it all as just a kind of modeling exercise where all that we can be interested in is the similarities. But also the aspects that they do bring out. So, for example, something seems to me one learns from Melancholia, although obviously it's also in ancient Stoicism and so on, is that even if you did know that there was an absolute cutoff, that would not render all aspects of life meaningless. And that's a very important point that, for example, it would be good if more of the protagonists of the Children of Men themselves, as it were to learn.
Yes, in fact, in the book, which is, I don't think it's a very well-written book, but one of the things it does that the film doesn't is it has certain characters portray that perspective, so they keep fighting. they are holding the flame against the apathy, against the destruction. So yeah, I take that point.
Stefan, thank you so much.
Thank you, Simon. And I've enjoyed the talk so far this morning, and I'll continue watching if they're live. So thanks very much for that.
Wonderful, and good luck in the very near future.
The very near future. Yes, thank you. Okay.